Well, thank you very much, Dr. Aronson, for the kind introduction and the very gracious welcome to the laboratory. I've been more than impressed, I guess I could say overwhelmed with the tour that I was provided earlier today. I haven't had such a feeling of being overwhelmed since my first day as an undergraduate in Chemistry 101, when I looked over the syllabus there and realized maybe I was in over my head. I think that's the day I decided to become a history major, actually. So I'd like to thank Dr. Peter Wanderer and Dr. Leslie Fischel and other members of the program committee for inviting me. It's certainly an honor to be here. Before as I was preparing my talk, I looked at the list of the marvelously distinguished people who have given lectures here, and I noticed among them was former Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall, who talked on a topic similar to what I'm talking about today, the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August of 1945. Okay. And in his talk, former Secretary of the Interior Stuart Udall suggested that the United States owed the Japanese people an apology for the use of the nuclear weapons in an effort to bring the Second World War to a close. I guess in a war that lasted at least 8 years, depending on how you're counting, 7 or 8 years, and in which there were 55 million deaths, most of them, the overwhelming majority of deaths, civilians, I imagine there are lots of apologies that could be issued by many governments in response to a number of deeds. Truman himself never apologized for the use of the atomic weapons, and in fact, at least publicly, he made it known that it was his decision and his alone to authorize the bomb's use. Some months after the end of the Second World War, Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, the chief scientist on the Manhattan Project, was in Truman's office, and Oppenheimer expressed to Truman Oppenheimer's remorse about the use of the atomic weapons, and said that he felt maybe it wasn't necessary, and that Oppenheimer felt a sense of I don't know if he used the word actually guilt, but certainly remorse. And Truman responded by saying, "Well, you don't need to feel anything one way or another about the use of the atomic bombs. You were doing your job. It was a job to which you were assigned, and I was doing my job. My job as Commander-in-Chief of the United States military was to make that decision. I made the decision alone. If anyone who should feel one way or another, it would be me." So I don't know whether Dr. Oppenheimer felt any sense of relief after this or not, but once he left the office, Harry Truman turned to one of his advisors and said, "I don't want to ever see that SOB in my office again." He didn't use the acronym SOB, I'm sure. Well, throughout his life, Harry Truman maintained that he authorized the use of the atomic bombs in August of 1945 for only one objective: to bring the war against Japan to a conclusion as soon as possible. Truman believed that his decision saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of American and Allied sailors and soldiers. He also believed that his action saved countless Japanese who would have died had the war continued. In addition, tens of thousands of Chinese, Koreans, Filipinos, and others living in areas occupied by the Japanese military would have certainly perished. Historians will forever debate the necessity of the atomic bombs. But Truman, at least publicly, expressed no reservations. However, his actions following Hiroshima and Nagasaki indicate that President Truman realized immediately that the world had entered a new and terrifying era. As Commander-in-Chief for nearly 8 years, Truman moved to impose unprecedented restraints on his military commanders, and established unquestioned presidential control over atomic weapons. The atomic weapons quickly became the dominant element in American military power and the linchpin of American military strategy during the Cold War. Therefore, it is not surprising that the nuclear option was considered by the United States military in times of crisis. Perhaps what is more surprising is that Truman ordered no further use of nuclear weapons during the remaining years of his administration. Despite the United States monopoly on nuclear weapons until 1949, and an overwhelming superiority in nuclear weaponry at the time of the Korean War. In fact, at the time of the outbreak of the Korean War in June of 1950, the American numerical superiority in nuclear weapons was 70-1. While serving, let me throw up a slide here. There we go. This is Truman on Inauguration Day in 1945 in January with Franklin Roosevelt and former Vice President Henry Wallace, who had been Secretary of Agriculture and then Vice President for one term, but was actually dumped by party leaders in favor of someone that seemed more acceptable to both Northerners and Southerners, and that was Harry Truman. Let me show one other here. Whoops. This is Truman after the inauguration. Truman only met with Franklin Roosevelt twice during the time he was vice president. Both times there was the press in attendance, so they never really talked about anything in great detail. And in fact, Truman never attended cabinet meetings at this time as vice president. At this particular meeting with Roosevelt, they were having a little luncheon, and Truman noticed that when Roosevelt went to pour some cream into his coffee, his hand was shaking so badly that one of the White House servants had to come and take the creamer and pour the cream into his coffee. So an indication, at least to Truman, that Roosevelt's health was in a dangerous situation. While serving as United States Senator from Missouri, and then as Vice President of the United States for a brief 82 days prior to the sudden death of Franklin Roosevelt, Truman was aware of the secret weapons program underway during World War II. However, he had no specific knowledge of the atomic bomb and its devastating capabilities until 13 days after he assumed the presidency. On April 25, 1945, Secretary of War Henry Stimson and General Leslie Groves, the head of the top-secret Manhattan Project, briefed Truman on the development of the atomic bomb. Immediately, Truman ordered Secretary Stimson to form an interim committee to study the possible uses of the new weapon. A scientific panel of the interim committee, headed by Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, considered the possibility of demonstrating the bomb's destructive power to the Japanese prior to its use. But the panel's final report stated, quote, "No technical demonstration is likely to bring the war to an end. We see no acceptable alternative to direct military use," end of quote. Meanwhile, a group of concerned scientists, and let me just move along here. Here's Secretary of War Stimson, who was nearly 80 years old at this time, and a Republican who had been brought in to provide a little bipartisan support for the war effort, and General Leslie Groves with Robert Oppenheimer. And this is the letter sent by the concerned scientists headed by Dr. Leo Szilard, expressing concern about the use of the atomic bomb. The scientists were at the University of Chicago and also the secret Los Alamos facility in New Mexico. They sought to caution the president on the use of the bomb. Dr. Szilard circulated a petition, which you see here, among his fellow scientists that urged a non-military demonstration. Szilard and his colleagues argued that the bombs should not be used, quote, unless the terms which will be imposed upon Japan have been made public in detail, and Japan, knowing the terms, has refused to surrender. Szilard's petition was not forwarded by General Groves to the White House until after the atomic bomb had been successfully tested and the two bombs used against the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So you can see that the date on this is July 17th, and by the time it was sent, Truman was at Potsdam meeting with Churchill and Stalin. Also, I should point out it's not clear from the archival records held at the Truman Library whether or not Truman ever saw this petition. He certainly didn't see it until after he returned from Potsdam, at which time the first bomb had been used against Hiroshima. And there's no mention in his correspondence. He does not respond to Szilard or anyone else. And the way this item was filed indicates that he probably never saw it, that the president never saw this document. President Truman was meeting with his British and Soviet counterparts in Potsdam, Germany, on July 18, 1945, when he received a message from General Groves that the atomic bomb had been successfully tested 2 days earlier at the Trinity site in Alamogordo, New Mexico. After deliberating with his advisors and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Truman informed Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin on July 24th of, quote, a new weapon of unusual destructive force, end of quote. Stalin appeared, in Truman's term, unimpressed. Of course, we now know that Stalin had spies in the United States, including at Los Alamos, who kept him apprised of developments on the Manhattan Project. And in fact, up until his briefing by Leslie Groves and Secretary Stimson, Premier Stalin probably knew more about the Manhattan Project than the President of the United States. Several days after his meeting with Stalin, Truman approved an official public announcement concerning the use of the atomic bomb. The announcement was to be issued only after August 2nd, a date by which Truman would have departed Potsdam and would be at sea, returning to the United States. There's Truman at Potsdam with Churchill and Premier Stalin. The Hiroshima, I guess this is actually the Alamogordo test site. Groves and Oppenheimer again. This is Truman's handwritten note, and this is on the back of a draft public release, or basically a press release. And Truman's, to the Secretary of War, reply to your 41011 suggestions approved, release when ready, but not sooner than August 2nd. And so actually what he's really approving here is the press release. It's not saying release the bomb, but obviously the implication is if you're approving this public message, the bombs have been approved. But this is the closest thing we have in the documents at the Truman Library or anywhere else, as far as we know, to a written authorization for the use of the bombs. At this time, Truman was willing to allow his military to deploy the atomic weapons according to plans they had already put in place. In a journal entry on July 25th, Truman wrote that the, quote, the target will be purely a military one, and we will issue a warning statement asking the Japs to surrender and save lives, end of quote. We don't know exactly what Truman knew about the nature of the targets designated by the military. Certainly, the cities listed as possible targets contained important military bases. However, civilians would be the primary targets in a nuclear attack. Moreover, no prior warning of the attack on specific targets was issued. And there was no prior warning in part because the interim committee report noted that any message specifying a specific attack might cause the Japanese to move American and Allied prisoners into the designated attack area where they would be killed. The Potsdam Declaration, however, issued by Truman, Churchill, and Stalin on July 26th, had issued a general warning to Japan of impending destruction if an offer of unconditional surrender was not forthcoming. On August 6, 1945, a devastating atomic bomb destroyed the city of Hiroshima, and 3 days later, the port city of Nagasaki was leveled by a second nuclear device. A day earlier, the Soviet Union had declared war on Japan and began attacking Japanese bases in Manchuria. The Emperor of Japan announced his nation's surrender in a radio broadcast on August 15th. When Truman authorized the use of the atomic weapons, he did not specify the number of bombs to be used. And in fact, in his note to himself, this journal entry, he refers to one bomb, or the bomb. He seems to have been caught off guard when informed on August 9th of the explosion of a second bomb on the city of Nagasaki. The following day, according to Commerce Secretary Henry Wallace, the president told his cabinet he had, quote, had given orders to stop atomic bombing. He said the thought of wiping out another 100,000 was too horrible, end of quote. Perhaps by this time, Truman was getting explicit information on the exact nature of the targets. Certainly, he was receiving reports about the extensive civilian casualties from Hiroshima. Truman's order to the military on August 10th may have saved Japan from further devastation from a third atomic bomb, which was at that time en route through the Pacific when Japan surrendered. While the United States maintained a monopoly on nuclear weapons from 1945 to 49, the atomic bomb never played a major role in post-war diplomatic efforts to confront Soviet expansion. The United States and the Soviet Union could not agree on international control of atomic energy, and a nuclear arms race ensued, leading to the development by both sides of a hydrogen bomb in the early 1950s. By this time, Congress had passed the administration-sponsored McMahon Act, which established a Civilian Atomic Energy Commission, the AEC, giving it control over both nuclear weapons and atomic energy for civilian use. Meanwhile, the American stockpile of atomic bombs grew dramatically, from 9 bombs in 1946 to over 650 by 1951. Oops. The Soviet blockade of Allied access to West Berlin in 1948 created the first international crisis of the Cold War. And Truman made clear his views on the nuclear option at that time. On July 21st, Secretary of Defense, this is 1948, Secretary of Defense James Forrestal and the Secretaries of the Army and Air Force argued that the President should transfer atomic weapons from civilian to military control. As they made their argument, David Lilienthal, head of the newly created Atomic Energy Commission, recalled Truman stating, quote, I don't think we ought to use this thing unless we absolutely have to. It's a terrible thing to order the use of something like that. It's so terribly destructive. This isn't a military weapon. It's used to wipe out women, children, and unarmed people. It's not for military uses. So we've got to treat this differently from rifles and cannon and ordinary things like that. End of quote. The military leaders were denied, and atomic weapons remained under the civilian control of the president. Just a note on the Berlin crisis. Truman did deploy at least a half a dozen B-29 bombers to an air base near London during the Berlin crisis. These aircraft were the same as used to deliver the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the B-29. But they were not equipped with nuclear weapons. They were not equipped to carry nuclear weapons, and they carried no atomic bombs. If the Soviets, however, viewed the deployment of these aircraft as a threat, it may have been the only time in the Cold War that Soviet policy was restrained by nuclear intimidation, even though it wasn't a real act of intimidation. The Korean War provided the most serious threat to American security during the Truman administration and during the early periods of the Cold War. And during that first year, the nuclear option was once again considered. Truman correctly viewed the June 1950 invasion of the Republic of Korea by North Korea, or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, as it is still known, as a Soviet-inspired and sponsored act of aggression. The administration reacted by obtaining a United Nations resolution that provided immediate international support and military aid to South Korea, or the Republic of Korea. General Douglas MacArthur, then in Tokyo serving as Supreme Commander of U.S. forces in the Far East, was placed in command of an American-led UN force to assist the failing Republic of Korea. In the first months of the war, the poorly armed and underprepared forces of South Korea were forced to retreat, along with their equally overmatched UN and American allies, and they retreated to the southernmost part of the Korean peninsula. This map gives you a sense of what Korea looked like in the first months of the war. The 38th parallel is the line right across the middle. South Korea, the yellow part, the red line showing the North Koreans forcing the South Korean or Republic of Korea forces and UN forces down to this little area in the far southeast corner of Korea known as the Pusan perimeter. The conflict changed dramatically in September 15th of 1950 when American, South Korean, and UN forces made an amphibious landing at the South Korean port city of Incheon near Seoul. Within weeks, Seoul was retaken, and President Truman authorized General Douglas MacArthur to cross the 38th parallel into North Korea. The United Nations also adopted a resolution on October 7th urging that, quote, all appropriate steps be taken to ensure conditions of stability throughout Korea, end of quote. On October 15th, so just a month after the successful invasion at Incheon, President Truman flew across the Pacific to Wake Island to meet with the victorious commander of the UN forces and discuss the conduct of the war. In particular, the president was concerned about warnings received from the People's Republic of China, received through indirect diplomatic channels, about the possibility of Chinese intervention if UN forces now moving through North Korea approached the Yalu River, which served as the border between China and North Korea. So here's MacArthur and his top advisors planning the Incheon invasion. MacArthur's with the hat on there and the leather jacket. Another map showing the breakout from the Pusan perimeter, the strong, bold blue arrow showing the Incheon invasion, and then the South Korean UN forces moving up and approaching the Yalu River. And this is Truman meeting with MacArthur at Wake Island. MacArthur's one of his characteristic poses. Those of you who are familiar with the picture taken of General Douglas MacArthur when he met with Emperor Hirohito after the surrender of Japan, MacArthur used that same pose, the kind of relaxed pose, informal, uniform, kind of hands on the hips, not at full attention. Once again, I think trying to make a statement about his authority relative to his own commander-in-chief in this case. At Wake Island, MacArthur confidently assured the president that there existed little possibility of Chinese invasion. And he stated that in the unlikely event that it did occur and the Chinese did enter the conflict, his air superiority would guarantee annihilation of Chinese forces. The general made public assurances that his troops would be home by Christmas. Unfortunately, MacArthur soon found that he had underestimated the Chinese. The People's Republic of China, allied since 1949, the previous year, with the Soviet Union, entered the Korean War in November with such force that the South Korean and UN troops were sent into a chaotic retreat. General MacArthur saw his great triumph turn to ruins. He now claimed that he was fighting a new war against a new enemy. He sought reinforcements and authority to expand the fighting into Chinese territory across the Yalu River. The disastrous reversals in Korea in November of 1950 also brought renewed consideration of the use of nuclear weapons. The nuclear option had been under consideration by military planners from the very beginning of the conflict. Within the first few weeks of the North Korean invasion of South Korea, General MacArthur urged a discussion among the Joint Chiefs of Staff to consider whether or not atomic bombs should be made available for use in the Korea conflict. On November 28th, the U.S. Army Plans and Operations Division reported a readiness to make, quote, prompt use of the atomic bomb if and when directed by the President, end of quote. President Truman, in a press conference on November 30th, unwisely, but very honestly, stated in response to a reporter's question that the U.S. military in Korea would take whatever steps were necessary to meet the military situation. When the reporter persisted, will that include the atomic bomb? Truman replied, quote, that includes every weapon we have. There has always been active consideration of its use. Unfortunately, the President also left the impression that the commander in the field, General Douglas MacArthur, would make the final decision on the use of all weapons, including nuclear bombs. Clarifications from the White House were quickly issued, but much of the damage had already been done. British Prime Minister Clement Attlee immediately arranged a visit to the United States to meet with the President and express British and Allied concerns about the possible escalation of the war in Korea. Once the Chinese entered the conflict in Korea, Truman and his top advisors and the Joint Chiefs of Staff all agreed that an all-out war with China had to be avoided. The Truman administration understood the fears of the NATO allies that attacks on military installations in China would likely bring the Soviet Union, now armed with their own nuclear bombs, into the conflict. The Truman administration also saw the real possibility of the war spreading to the Middle East and Western Europe, where Soviet conventional forces had an overwhelming superiority. MacArthur did not share the concerns of America's NATO allies or the concerns of Truman and his advisors. The Chinese entry into the war had damaged his military reputation, and the general was keen to restore it. From Tokyo, MacArthur issued bulletins claiming he had forced the Chinese hand by inviting their intervention, thereby disrupting plans for a more extensive counterattack by the Chinese. He blamed the administration for limiting his operations by restricting the bombing of Chinese military facilities across the Yalu. The general also argued that by fighting the Chinese and perhaps the Soviets in the Far East, the United States would actually be enhancing European security. There is no documentary evidence that as commander of U.S. and UN forces in Korea, MacArthur ever specifically called for the use of nuclear weapons. A number of MacArthur's statements on atomic weapons during the Korean conflict were made after he was relieved of his command. Nevertheless, in early December, MacArthur expressed his desire to have authority to decide on using atomic weapons in Korea, and on December 24th, in response to a Pentagon request, he provided a list of 27 targets suitable for bombing with nuclear weapons, at least suitable in his view. In February 1951, the general suggested that he would strike invasion forces within Korea and numerous concentrations of enemy air power beyond the invasion forces within Korea and concentrations of enemy air power, many of those concentrations within the Chinese border. He did not specify the use of the atomic bombs, but he later stated a belief that his action would have ended the war in 10 days. MacArthur also suggested cutting off North Korea from its Chinese ally by creating a no man's land of nuclear waste between the two countries. On March 10th of 1950, with the war at a stalemate and reports circulating, or indicating that Soviet forces might be massing along the North Korean border, MacArthur expressed a concern that the U.S. prepare for what he referred to as, quote, a D-Day atomic capability, end of quote. In April of 1951, the United States came as close as it ever would come during the Korean War to using nuclear weapons. To U.S. intelligence sources, it appeared that a coordinated communist offensive with massive Soviet support might drive the UN forces from the Korean Peninsula. President Truman authorized the transfer of 9 atomic bombs from Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, custody to the Strategic Air Command of the United States Air Force for relocation of these bombs to the Andersen Air Base in Guam. However, the bombers lacked the fissile cores and release authority for these bombs. Again, they weren't armed, but the release authority, if they were to be armed, clearly rested with the president. The Soviet threat never materialized, and in the spring of 1951, the tide of battle in Korea turned in favor of the United States and UN forces. Meanwhile, diplomatic channels opened the possibility of peace negotiations that would restore the two Koreas to roughly the status quo ante bellum, a resolution of the conflict that Truman and the Allies were now willing to accept. To keep MacArthur, and to a lesser extent other U.S. commanders, from making unhelpful statements while sensitive diplomatic efforts were underway, President Truman had issued an order to all theater commanders calling for extreme caution in public statements, which were to be cleared in advance by both the State Department and the Defense Departments. MacArthur famously and blatantly ignored this order. By March of 1951, it had become clear to the American public and Allied leaders that MacArthur's view on the conduct of the war were different from those of the administration in Washington. The UN and U.S. troops, actually these are U.S. troops under the UN command, retreating after the Chinese intervention. The heavy casualties suffered by Americans, South Koreans, and the UN forces. Truman with his key advisors, as you look at this slide on the left is Secretary of State Atchison and Secretary of War General George C. Marshall. On the right, a political cartoon of the time showing General MacArthur with his puppet spokesman speaking politically for him. Another cartoon showing the American administration with the two heads. Back to where I was. It had become clear to the American public that MacArthur's views on the conduct of the war differed from the administration in Washington. the general publicly argued for a wider war and authority to attack targets in China. It also appears from oral history interviews held at the Truman Library that the U.S. intelligence was monitoring MacArthur's private phone calls at this time. Phone calls from his headquarters in the Daiichi building in Tokyo, many of which were to foreign leaders like General Chiang Kai-shek and foreign diplomats. And in these conversations, MacArthur was apparently talking about the need to expand the war and was highly critical of the Truman administration, the administration's policies. We don't have those telephone calls. Those things are, if indeed this happened, that material is still classified. But what is not classified is the oral history interviews with officials who said this actually took place. So we have the oral history saying that there was a monitoring of by U.S. intelligence of MacArthur's phone calls, but the phone calls themselves are still classified, so we don't know exactly what was said. MacArthur's letter to Republican House Leader Joe Martin proved to be the final straw. On April 5, 1951, Representative Martin read on the floor of the U.S. House a letter from General MacArthur critical of administration policy and concluding, quote, "There is no substitute for victory." Truman relieved the general of his command on April 11th and replaced him with General Matthew Ridgway, who was already effectively leading U.S. and UN military efforts on the Korean Peninsula. President Truman stated that MacArthur was dismissed because, quote, "he was unable to give his wholehearted support to the policies of the United States government and the United Nations, and had not accepted that military commanders must be governed by the policies and directions issued to them in a manner provided in our laws and Constitution," end of quote. Many Americans supported MacArthur's call for an expanded war, and the old general returned to the United States to a hero's welcome. Meanwhile, the war in Korea bogged down in bloody fighting along a line that would eventually become the demilitarized zone, the present border between North and South Korea. And an armistice was eventually signed in the summer of 1953, several months after Truman left office. During this time, between the dismissal of MacArthur and Truman leaving office in January of 1952, Truman's popularity, his public approval rating, tanked to 25%. Historians now look at the Truman administration as foreign policy in a highly favorable light. The Republic of Korea was saved and a Third World War was avoided. Furthermore, Truman is credited with setting important precedents for future administrations. Henceforth, there would be undisputed civilian control of the military from the president, and the president alone would have the authority to order a nuclear strike. While the threat of nuclear weapons remained, succeeding American leaders would, during several times of crisis, exercise the same restraint and caution that President Truman had shown. In establishing these precedents, Truman set a course that broke with policies employed by every previous U.S. president. In fact, Truman himself acted much differently after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Military leaders throughout history, U.S. commanders included, have always been charged with employing every available weapon to achieve victory. With atomic weapons, Truman understood immediately that a president faced an entirely new situation, one that required the judgment of a nation's leader in a wide international context, rather than that of a military commander in the field of battle. Historian John Lewis Gaddis, perhaps our nation's greatest historian of the Cold War, John Gaddis has observed, President Truman reversed an ancient and fundamental pattern of human warfare. Quote, that when weapons are developed, they will be used. We can only hope that in the future, U.S. presidents and world leaders would continue the course Truman set after the events of August 1945 and exercise restraint and sound judgment in a complex world armed with nuclear weapons. Thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions.
At the time that Truman was making his decisions, was there any interaction with the Federation of Atomic Scientists, which was founded about that time?
Not that I know of. Oh, was there any interaction between Truman and the Federation of Atomic Scientists? Do I have that name right? Yeah. Which was founded about this time, the early Cold War period. And I don't know of any directly. Truman met with David Lilienthal, head of the Atomic Energy Commission. I mentioned his meeting with Dr. Robert Oppenheimer. But a group like that, I think it's most likely Truman would have worked through his own cabinet and his advisors rather than meeting with them directly.
Did Truman give enough time for Japan to consider giving up after the first, just a couple of days? Was that enough time?
Was it enough time between the first bomb, which was Hiroshima on August 6th, and the second, August 9th, against Nagasaki? Was there enough time for Japan to consider surrendering? Clearly, there was not, because Japan didn't surrender until August 15th. But the military had their own time schedule based on the availability of the bombs, the testing of the bombs, weather conditions over Japan. And I think Truman himself was a bit taken aback, a bit surprised that the second bomb was dropped as quickly as it was. But even after the second bomb, let me say this, after the first bomb, the Japanese weren't really sure what had happened. They sent observers down to Hiroshima to look at the damage, and it took a while for the information to get back to the emperor and his cabinet. It took a while for information to get back to Truman as well. But even after the second bomb, when the emperor met with his cabinet and decided, and also by this time the Soviet Union had entered the war against Japan, which clearly was important in their thinking because the Japanese knew that with the Soviets in the war, their huge armies, the huge Japanese armies on the mainland of China, would not be coming back. They would be destroyed. But even when the emperor said we're going to surrender, there was a coup in the palace and against the peace faction of the emperor's own cabinet, and it was just by luck that the plot was discovered and it failed, or the war might have continued for some time. It's also, some historians have suggested that the atomic bombs gave the Japanese a certain amount of cover. It allowed them to save face. If you look at the Japanese, the surrender document, it doesn't really mention the Soviet Union entering the war. It mentions these new terrible bombs that the United States is using. It's almost as if we were doing okay in this war, and then suddenly we got sucker punched by the United States with these atomic weapons or these new devastating weapons, and so we have no choice now. If the Americans are going to play that way, we may as well just surrender. I mean, you can maybe put that kind of spin on the surrender document. So there were those in Japan clearly who felt the war could continue. They had 5,000 kamikaze pilots in training. They felt if they could continue another 6 months or longer, they could inflict enough casualties on the United States that the Americans would become war-weary and reach some kind of settlement, which would be something short of occupying the Japanese home islands, maybe allow Japan to keep Korea and Manchuria, this sort of thing.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah. The question is, since Truman was reluctant to use the bombs and was determined to do everything he could not to use them, why did he allow over 600 of these devices to be built during his administration? And also, Truman authorized the program to develop the hydrogen bomb, or the super, as they called it at that time. And the only answer is that Truman's military advisors convinced him that having this overwhelming preponderance of power was the best way to secure the United States. In fact, in the early years of the Cold War, from 1945 really until the Korean War, I think you could say, the United States was very concerned about balancing its budget. The United States ended the Second World War with a huge debt. The ratio of debt to GDP was actually higher at the end of World War II than it is now, according to the sources I've seen. And so balancing the budget seemed to be very important. Cutting back on the military, 13 million men and women were mustered out of the armed services in 1945 and 46. So the nuclear weapons seem like an inexpensive way to have security. You wouldn't need a large standing army. You could intimidate opponents, and the United States felt that it would have this monopoly for some time. Well, then in 1949, the Soviet Union got the bomb. The United States ratcheted up its production, not only of the atomic bombs, but also of the hydrogen bomb. So, yeah, Truman was well aware of what was happening, and at least until the Korean War, thought this was a cost-effective, inexpensive way of providing for national security. Anything else? It's kind of dark out there. I really can't see the hands. Okay.
It's my understanding that prior to the dropping of the bomb, that Japan had put forth the possibility of surrendering, but did not agree to an unconditional surrender.
Right.
That entered into the decision-making process.
Right. The Japanese had, through their diplomats in Moscow, made overtures to the American embassy. Averell Harriman was our representative in Moscow then, suggesting that there could be a negotiated settlement. But the negotiated settlement, at least initially, it was clear that the Japanese wanted no occupation of the home islands. They wanted to be able to maintain as much as they could of their military structure, including their own research and development projects. It was clear that they felt Taiwan, or Formosa as it was called then, was Japanese territory. It had been taken from the Chinese in 1895. Korea had been annexed in 1910. Manchuria, parts of Manchuria had been part of Japan for almost 15 years by that time. So their terms were for a pretty lenient peace in terms of what Japan would suffer if it did surrender. And finally it got down to the question of the emperor and his authority, and even the final surrender documents were kind of ambiguous about what the role of the emperor would be, but it was close enough that the United States could say, well, the emperor will serve as a temporal ruler. He won't be divine, or he won't be a god, and that was close enough. Both sides were willing to consider that an unconditional surrender. But the early peace overtures, it wasn't clear to the Americans that they really came from the highest authorities in Japan, and it appeared that Japan was asking for some pretty lenient terms given what had happened and what the situation was, and that if the United States had agreed to anything close to those terms, it would have been a great betrayal of allies, particularly the Chinese. Oh, we got one couple over here. There's one in the back over there. No, no, over here. Do you see?
Oh, way over on the far left, sorry.
Okay, the question is, why didn't FDR confide more in his vice president and Vice President Truman? I think the first reason is that FDR didn't intend to die, ever. I mean, I just think FDR didn't think that was possible. Before he left for Yalta, he had a physical, and his doctors looked at his blood pressure and it was just off the charts, and he had all kinds of other problems. And they said, you've got to take better care of yourself. So FDR agreed that he would take better care of himself by cutting back from 3 packs a day to 2. That's how he would improve his health. Also, FDR didn't confide much to anybody in his cabinet. He was notorious for telling different things to different people and assigning the same task to 2 different members of his cabinet or his advisors, and seeing what the different people came up with without telling each other that they were working on this, without telling them that they were working on the same project. He was a very fly by the seat of the pants administrator, and also he didn't like Truman that much. He felt Truman was kind of an embarrassment as a senator in his first term. He was from the Pendergast machine in Kansas City. I think Roosevelt felt that Truman was something of a pain in the backside because Truman chaired this Senate committee to examine wartime graft and corruption and mismanagement during the war effort. Roosevelt was quite happy with Henry Wallace, who was a good, solid New Deal guy, but it was the party bosses, big city mayors, union leaders, and Southern politicians who didn't like Wallace and said, you got to get somebody else. They looked around. Richard Russell from Georgia and Jimmy Burns from South Carolina were just unacceptable to Northern liberals, to blacks in the party, to Jews. Truman was a Southerner. Both sets of his grandparents had been slave owners. He was from a border state, but he was okay with labor. He always had Jewish support in Kansas City, support of labor and blacks. He was from a big city political machine, the Pendergast machine, so people in Chicago and the Kelly Nash machine said, well, he's one of our guys. So he was the compromise. In fact, after his nomination as to be the running mate with FDR, someone said he was America's second Missouri Compromise. Okay, so, but Truman himself, after when he began his second term, his vice president was a former senator or a Senate colleague, Alvin Barkley of Kentucky, and Truman made a point of always involving Barkley in the cabinet meetings and set a precedent that continues to this day. And there was a question way in the back there, the gentleman, yeah.
It's actually not a question, it's a follow-up statement. Just you mentioned the near coup to prevent the emperor from broadcasting the surrender terms. One of my professors was in one of the biological effects on ionizing radiation studies, studying the bomb survivors. And back in the 70s, he spoke to Nagasaki survivors. 6 days after the bombing, when the broadcast came out, the local military commandant came and told everyone that was a filthy, vicious lie, and you had to be prepared to repel the Americans on the shore with bamboo spears if necessary. Just 6 days after that, I find that's really an example of there was a hardcore we will not surrender.
Right. The gentleman talked about a civic leader in Nagasaki saying that the radio message where the Emperor of Japan announces the surrender was a trick by the Americans and that they were going to fight to the very end. In fact, many Japanese, they'd never heard the Emperor speak before on the radio or anywhere else, so it was kind of a shock, and I'm sure there were people who were in disbelief because they had been told the war effort was going pretty well. And in fact, the Emperor sent high-ranking members of his cabinet and even members of the royal family out to China, to French Indochina, which was occupied by Japan, to the Philippines, where there's still fighting was going on, Indonesia, Korea, to meet with Japanese commanders. The Emperor had to send out people that would be known to these generals to say, yes, that really was the Emperor. Yes, we really are surrendering, because many of the Japanese soldiers in those countries had never tasted defeat. They had never been defeated on the field. They had been successful, and the information that they were being given was that the war was actually going quite well. Now, maybe there were some who saw through that, but by and large, it took some convincing to persuade the Japanese military leaders, at least all of them, that the war was really over.
Let's thank our speaker again.